Welcome to the Eye of Power podcast. I'm your host, Tom Dardick. But this podcast is not about me. It's about you and your power. It's time to claim yours. On this week's Eye of Power podcast, I'd like to welcome George Hutton to the show. George is a prolific writer with over 100 books published, and he is a persuasion expert studying hypnotism, and he has a practice where he helps people with their abilities to persuade and influence, as well as a lot of other insights. The funny thing is in our discussion, we really didn't even get into that stuff. We got into a more broad spectrum of discussion around what makes us tick and why things are the way they are. And I found it fascinating, and I hope you do too. Without further ado, let's welcome George Hutton to the show. So the first question I have for you, George, is being such a prolific writer as you are, that separates you. Most people have a book or some sort of masterpiece that they'd like to get out, and they struggle for years. My novel took me 10 years to write. That came out a couple of years ago, and I'm still working on the sequel. And I think most people have a tough time with that kind of production that you've been able to do, 100 books, something like that, right? So the question is, what makes you, what's your secret? What's your special sauce? What's your unique approach to at least output and a passion that keeps you at it for an extended period of time?
Well, there's a couple answers in there. The first was that my first novel that I wrote took about a year to write. And that when you write your first novel, there's all kinds of doubts and insecurities. And what happens if I publish it and nobody buys it? What happens? And there's also that kind of fear of success. What happens if I'm massively successful? And that fear of success usually lives down in our subconscious because we're afraid of suddenly all this attention coming at us. And I don't know if I can handle that. And so after I kind of slogged through the first novel and got it done, it was something that was familiar then. And even writing the first novel, one of the things I heard, or one of the pieces of advice I heard long ago, was that when you sit down to write, don't think about writing a certain number of words. Instead, think about writing for a specific number of minutes, and just sit down and start writing. And it also kind of folds in with the idea of a couple of ideas. One from Michelangelo, I believe this quote, and I'm not saying I'm like Michelangelo in any way, but there's a quote, I think, from Michelangelo that says, when I start to do a sculpture, I imagine the sculpture is already inside the rock. It's just my job to get it out. Another kind of idea from Hemingway is that when you write drunk, but edit sober. And so when I kind of sit down to write for my allotted amount of time per the day, I don't really concern myself with the actual quality of the writing that I'm doing. I just, in my mind, I'm kind of creating the rock, and then later I'll chip away all the junk and get to the sculpture that's inside the rock, or write drunk and edit sober. And so that kind of mindset helped me to write a whole lot of words per day if I have a certain amount of time allotted for that writing. So that kind of built into my kind of daily productivity. And when I was starting to write as prolifically as I did after I wrote my first novel, I just had a schedule. And I figured I would take this many weeks to write a book. Every day I would write for an hour. And then when I had a certain number of words, I would kind of edit it down. I would release the book, and then I would go on to the next one. It wasn't kind of the way writers that haven't really written a lot, you had this idea that I had this massive idea, and once I get this massive idea out of my head into a book, it'll have this massive significant impact, and it's going to be this great fantastic thing. Once you kind of get over that and realize that's not really what happens, then it's just a matter of keeping your schedule. And if you write every day, then every so many days you're going to pump out a book, and you just keep pumping out new books, and you get into the habit of just figuring out what you're going to write next, and it's just part of your daily habit. And for me, it was kind of like doing daily exercise. It's just something that you do every day. You can't imagine not doing it every day. And so once you kind of get into that habit, it's easy. Just as long as you write every day, you're going to kick out a certain number of books per time period. And if you do that time period long enough, before you know it, you'll have a few dozen books out there.
The Stephen King method, right? I think his routine is what, from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. every day, and that's it.
Yeah, yeah,
Something like
yeah,
that.
yeah. And there's a story of, I believe it was Roger Bannister who broke the 4 minute mile. And once he broke the 4 minute mile, all other people, or a lot of other people, started to break the 4 minute mile because they simply were aware that it was possible. And
Right.
another kind of experience I had was when I was reading the book Going Clear. I think it was called Going Clear, which was later turned into an HBO documentary about Scientology. And early in the book, they were talking about L. Ron Hubbard before he invented Scientology. And he was a very prolific science fiction writer. And he
Yeah.
would just sit down and just bang out thousands of words per day. And just knowing that that was possible seemed to make it a lot easier for me to kind of do the same thing. Well, if this guy can do it, I can do it. I mean, what's the difference?
So you saw that it was possible, and then the word that strikes me as you relate your story and approach George is discipline.
Yeah, absolutely. Daily discipline is absolutely necessary. It's about 180 degrees away from the stereotypical fictional author who wanders around town with his laptop waiting for inspiration to hit him and trying to come up with an idea. It's just every day, the daily grind, the same thing day in and day out.
Right, right. Well, yeah, that makes sense. And I suppose that happens, that the same thing applies across disciplines, where, I mean, across that discipline to different areas of our lives. So for you, it's writing. For other people, it might be getting in shape, or
Mhm.
some other goal that they might have, a project of some kind, a business, some other artistic
Yeah, yeah.
expression, something
If
like
if
that.
you can figure out a measurable way to do a daily grind, like if you did a certain number of push-ups every day, if you wrote for a certain number of minutes every day, and you just practice some kind of skill every day as something you would just do forever, within a year or two, you would be fantastic at that skill.
So that brings me to the next thing I was wondering about, which is, as you've applied this discipline over a very long period of time, you you find things out about yourself, right? You find a
Oh,
voice, you find
absolutely.
commonalities, things emerge that you wouldn't have
Absolutely.
predicted. So my question to you
Absolutely.
then, George, is what emerged for you that is most noteworthy, that might be of value to other people?
Well, the thing that I discovered most about myself is when I was a lot younger, I had the common idea that here I am in my present state, and there's this future state that I hope is better. And I get this thing, I get this income, I get a girlfriend, I lose this weight, whatever. And it's kind of a transactional kind of imagination that I do this to get that. But what I really realized is that it's not so much as what can I do to get that one thing, it's the continuous feeling that you have of continuous improvement once you're kind of on that daily grind where you're doing the daily discipline, where you look back in the past 6 months and you think, wow, when I first started, I could only do 2 push-ups. Now I'm doing 100 every morning. That feels fantastic. What might I be like a year from now? And that's kind of the biggest aha moment I've had about not just myself, but the structure of just continuously moving through your life and getting better and better.
So that joy of progress, and
Yeah.
enjoying the journey, right?
Exactly, exactly. That's I think what they mean when they say the road is better than the end.
Mm. What do you why do you think that isn't something that we are taught, or that we, in other words, why do we have to learn that the hard way? Why isn't that just the normal thing that we would think? Like, enjoy the road, enjoy the journey, enjoy each day. I mean, we say it, but it's one thing to kind of hear it here, and it's another thing to internalize it, right?
Yeah, yeah. I have kind of a weird idea about how that is. And a lot of my recent last couple of years, recent understanding about human nature and the human condition and human problems is because of what anthropologists or evolutionary psychologists call instinct mismatch.
Ooh.
And I honestly believe that most modern problems are because the instincts that we have were generated for a world that was much different than the world we live in today. And so that creates a lot of confusion. And if you think about a group of ancient hunter gatherers who essentially were migrating to follow the animals, because if you have 50 people in an ancient tribe of humans, that's 50 people that each need 2,000 calories per day, which means that group of 50 people needs to extract 100,000 calories from the environment per day. And the only way to really do that is to take down a big animal. And so
Right.
they were kind of following these big animals. So they were always on their purpose, but it was something that they didn't have to ever think about. They just kept following the animals because that's what they had to do. They didn't have a choice. And so ancient humans, with our collection of instincts, were very much constrained by their environment. It's kind of similar to the problem of obesity in modern society. Back then, because food was so scarce, nobody had to worry about getting fat.
Right.
And so people were always hungry. And the hungrier you were, the more motivated you were to find something to eat. But today, that massive hunger instinct can kill us today.
Right.
And in a lot of similar ways, the instincts that helped us back then are kind of making us go in the opposite direction today.
That's a
And one
fantastic.
kind of subtle idea you can think about with a group of hunter gatherers chasing some big game animal, you can do a kind of a split test between two tribes. They have everything the same except for this one kind of instinct that this tribe over here has. And this tribe, when they're chasing after a woolly mammoth or some big animal, they have this false idea, this false belief that once we get that big animal, everything's going to be perfect.
Mm.
And it's an absolutely irrational belief, but it would make them a little bit more motivated than this other tribe who has this kind of Vulcan like logical understanding that once they get this big animal, it'll last for a week. They'll have all kinds of problems. They'll be itching to get out hunting again, and they won't be as motivated as this tribe. And so we have this kind of belief today that this next thing is the one thing that's going to make everything better. And then we get that thing and it doesn't make everything better. We get kind of a letdown and we have to kind of wait for our environment to force us to get back on the hunt again. And that doesn't actually happen as effectively as it used to. This tribe that has this belief that this next big kill is going to be the greatest thing ever, they get the big kill and it does feel good for a couple of days, but then their environment essentially forces them to get back on the road, so to speak. But today, that doesn't happen nearly as naturally as it used to. So it's really easy to feel let down, even when you achieve a fantastic goal. I watched a fantastic interview with the guy who played Jack Reacher on that Amazon show. And he was talking about the massive letdown that he had. He'd been trying so long to make a breakthrough in acting. And he finally got the first couple of big roles. And he was horrified because he thought he'd been chasing an empty dream because when he got there, there was no magic payoff.
Mm.
And that's kind of the feeling we get when we're chasing these big goals. And we have this false belief that this next big thing is going to be the one thing that fixes everything. But we get it, and it's not nearly as great as we thought. And it can leave us very depressed and let down and off that path. And so
That
it's
apply.
not at all natural in modern life to feel based on our environment that we're always on a good path. It's something you have to kind of understand and manage on your own, just like you have to understand and manage your own hunger instinct if you want to stay healthy. And so I think the key takeaway is that to be a successful human, you have to understand and manage all of your instincts as much as you can. If you let your instincts drive your life, you're going to be a train wreck.
So I've got a few questions based on what you shared there, George. Um, one thing is the distinction we make between, say, the instincts and emotions. In other words, some people are guided by their feelings, right? So I feel this way, I feel like this. How might somebody distinguish between instinct and emotion, or is there a distinction? What does that difference look like, and what are the tools that we use to manage those perceptions?
Well, there's a lot of interdependent variables inside our own instincts and our own emotions. And a lot of it is our capability of kind of going meta. One of the
Right.
problems humans have is going meta too often. Like we have a desire, but we think about our desire. We think about how we think about our desire. We start to get feelings about how we think about our desire. And that can get really, really confusing. Another kind of variable that a lot of people have trouble with is the short-term desires versus our long-term desires. And almost always when we focus on short-term desires, they come at a cost at long-term success. And almost always when we want to build long-term success, we have to pay a little bit of short-term discomfort. I mean, it's fantastic to have a six pack, take off your shirt, get all the girls looking at you. But to get that, you have to not really eat what you want to eat. You have to not eat as much as you want to eat. So you have to suffer a little bit of short term discomfort to get that long term desire, that long term outcome. And so the interplay between instincts and emotions is really, really complex. And there's really not any kind of easy way to kind of get a handle on them. There's a lot of consistent things you can do on a daily basis to manage them on a consistent basis, but there's not really any kind of understanding or a way to think about them to make it easy. And so one way you can do that is always be aware of both your short-term behaviors and what they'll create in the long term, and whether or not your long-term behavior is creating that kind of road is better than the in feeling, and having an understanding of what your instincts are telling you to do versus what your rational mind is telling you that you probably should do instead. And one of the best ways to manage all that is to have what I call directional goals or horizon goals, where you're going in a direction. Like, a lot of goal programs say that your goal should be well formed and time limited, and I absolutely disagree with that, because that is very, very dangerous, because you might, once you put a time limit on something and you're starting to fall behind, that can create a lot of stress. But I recommend instead having directional goals or horizon goals where you say, well, 1 year from now, I'm going to be healthier than I am today. 1 year from now, I'm going to have better social skills than I have today. 1 year from now, I'm going to have more income than I have today. And so every day you do something to move towards that. And all of these directional goals are based on our basic instincts. Like, everybody wants to be healthy. Everybody wants to have a nice set of friends and social status and social validation. Everyone wants a nice romantic relationship. And so long as you're moving in the direction of those instincts, or you're letting those instincts guide your horizon goals, and you keep track of what you do every day to get there, that can help you kind of keep everything in kind of a balance, so you don't spin out of control and start to just be manic or whatever.
Right. Well, when you were talking about the instincts and the environment, one of the things that came up for me is how our environments continually change. And with the advent of AI and automation,
Yeah.
and we're entering a
Yeah.
new place where the rules are changing pretty rapidly
Yes.
and it's hard to orient. So what's your view as to how things are evolving, will evolve, continue? Specifically, does any of this change your approach in any way, or what you'd advise other people to think about?
Well, in a general kind of recommendation, it's always the individual's responsibility to understand their environment as much as possible. I mean, just after World War II in the 50s, the American economy was booming, mainly because every factory in the world had been destroyed or hadn't been invented yet. And so you could just stumble out of high school, wander down the street, get a factory job, and make enough money to support a family. And you didn't ever have to really think about what you were doing. And this,
Right.
unfortunately, has been the way humans have been living since the dawn of time. We've never really had it forced upon us to kind of think about our environment. We always were constrained and controlled by our environment, which today, if you do that, it's going to be disastrous. And so you have to do a lot of proactive thinking and proactive understanding of the environment, and be really, really responsible for your own livelihood, your own health, your own well being. And that's really, really hard, because that's not ever taught by anything. I mean, you go through the school system and you're taught to just show up, do what you're told, and take your
Right.
paycheck, go home. But you have to really, really be proactive in understanding the environment. And as far as today, with the rapidly changing environment, there's going to be a lot of people that get left behind.
Yeah, that's something that I think about a lot. And part of what we're doing with the Eye of Power idea is those that come in will be using the latest tools to help them, whatever the problem might be. So I see a need for people to. Some people are jumping in, right? There's lots of people that are running with it, and I'm taking an AI mastery course right now and learning all these different things and it's changing every day. I mean, the same
Yeah.
tool that you used 2 weeks ago
Yeah.
is different now.
Right.
So
Right.
so
Right.
it's very, and I don't know that we're sort of in the steep part of the curve at the moment. We'll probably reach some sort of a plateau where it's possible to sort of figure things out a little bit. But I think what you pointed to there, George, is important because people are going to, part of our instinct is to say, I don't understand that. That's, put that thing that's different and troublesome at arm's length.
Mm-hmm.
And so that idea, I don't think participation is very optional if you want to be competitive and productive in the modern
Oh,
environment.
absolutely, absolutely. If you want to be successful and earn a decent living, I believe it's absolutely incumbent on the individual to proactively understand their skill set, understand the marketplace, to always be looking for ways to maximize the interplay between their skill set and the marketplace, and always be looking for any way possible to improve their skill set. And that includes all the advances in technology. If you can proactively do that, you can thrive in the coming changes. But if you're not willing to do that, and a lot of people have that attitude, why should I do this unless I'm going to get this first? That's a recipe for homelessness in the next 10 years or so.
So what do you think? And this might be a little bit of a turn off of the turnpike here, so maybe we don't go too far, but what do you think happens? I don't know what the percentages will be. Pareto's rule tends to work out pretty well. 20% of the people are going to produce
Yeah,
80% of the goods, and 80% of the
right.
people are going to be stuck with the rest of the 20%. And that's not a tenable kind of way to run a society or a world. So something's got to give, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's always been that way. I watched a series of lectures once on the changes during the Middle Ages.
Mm,
And that the Pareto principle still played out during the Middle Ages. The top 20% made most of the wealth. The bottom 80% were showing up every day, trying their best, hoping to get in that top 20%. But because the growth of the economy was slow enough, everybody could kind of be part of the rising tide that lifts all ships. But today there's almost like a disconnect. It's almost as if the top 20% or the top 10% are about to reach escape velocity from everybody else
mm,
and just leave everybody behind.
mhm,
And one thing that can definitely skew the Pareto distribution is if the people at the top are actively rigging the system in their favor so that
yeah.
they can leave the people behind, which makes it even more imperative for people to really, really, really take control of their own skill set and their own future. Because if you even blink, you'll be part of the group that gets left behind as the people in charge take over. And with the AI changing so quickly, I mean, I'm not really a conspiracy theorist, but I see a lot of these big name people that work for Google and all these other big companies that are saying AI is super dangerous. We need to have some kind of regulatory body to manage this. And that to me sends off my alarm bells because that seems like they want to kind of use that as a backdoor to help control things even more than they already are.
I tend to think that way myself. It's the fact of the matter is these tools are great democratizers, right?
Yeah,
They
they
take
can
away
be.
the they take right by their nature, they take away the barriers to entry. So what you're pointing to would be, oh, well, we would need a barrier to entry here. And so, so
Right, 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 right.
and they might not even think of it that way. That's the thing about these ideas, right? A person that believes that that's the right thing to do may not be thinking I need to slam the door on people behind me, but that's the way
Right.
these ideas tend to work, right? They're self-serving.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
so they have these organic elements of them that have these survive talk about instincts. They have these survival instincts around ideas themselves.
Yeah.
So that's we fall into these cognitive traps then, right?
Yeah, well, speaking of a cognitive trap, there is an actual theory in evolutionary psychology that way back in the day when we lived in small tribes of people, no one would ever think to lie to somebody else because if you lied to your tribal member, you'd get kicked out. But then when they discovered agriculture and people started living around people they'd never seen before, it became profitable to lie to somebody. You could sell them a bag of corn that was really half corn and half rocks or something. And if you never saw them again, but then the people being lied to, as the theory goes, they evolved the kind of anti-lying intuition where they could sort of suspect that this guy is not altogether congruent. But then the liars evolved an anti-lying strategy, and that was to first lie to themselves so they could more effectively lie to somebody else. And that's kind of where we are now. So a lot of the ideas we have are maybe not what we think they are. Like you said, these guys on top might not be blatantly saying, ha, 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 we're going to run everything. They might be thinking in terms of, I need to help these people. But in reality, that's a self-serving false belief that will actually allow them to subconsciously, ha, 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 take over everything.
I love that because it gives me a little different way to look at it. I always framed it thinking people believe what they want to believe. And you just gave a better framework, or an expanded framework that says this is a strategy. This is a strategy that under these circumstances pays off.
Right.
I like
right.
that. That's good. It helps us make sense of things, of why things are. So then we don't have to play a game of blame, or we don't have to play.
Right.
We don't have
Right.
we don't have to be resentful or guilt ridden. We can just acknowledge and move on with that discipline and that
Yeah.
responsibility that you've already laid out.
Right.
So
Right.
critical. That's awesome. So the path forward, then, we have these challenges with new tools and riffs and so forth. Do you think about or write about this in any way? How does this affect your strategy or your personal path going forward? How
Well,
are you adjusting?
I'm absolutely always a fan of new technology. In fact, last couple of weeks I've been looking at some AI tech that I can use in my business, and just the act of discovering what's possible is making my brain kind of go on fire about some of the new products that I can make with this new AI technology. And a lot of my books on income generation and careers and whatnot, I say it's incumbent upon the person to always spend at least portion of their time looking at new skills that they can learn. I mean, if you were a factory worker in a factory, you wouldn't have to think about that because the factory owners would figure out the new technology and they would make sure that employees learned about the new technology, and that would be that. But if you're in charge of your own life, and I think everybody really should think as an entrepreneur, even if they work for a company, because if you don't think ahead of what's coming and don't kind of proactively figure out what you need to do next before the pink slip comes in your mailbox, you're going to be left behind. And so new technology is always fascinating. It's always interesting. It all helps me to come up with all kinds of better ideas about how to do stuff and get the message out that people need to be as proactive as possible.
Do you have some projects coming up that you're excited about?
Yeah, I don't really want to say too much because one of the things about being an entrepreneur is you're always worried about the competition. You always want
Sure.
to get these new tools. But I have this new kind of idea that I've been cooking for the past couple of months that I'm going to test it out with a few early products. And if it's successful, I'm going to have it's just a whole new kind of area that I can promote it and create stuff in. And I'm really, really excited about it. I mean,
Wow.
I want to experiment, but so far I haven't found the time to create some experimental products with this experimental AI tech. But I think if it works even half as good as I hope it will be pretty fantastic for my customers.
The thing that piques my interest is I saw a video, I don't know, a month or two ago on, it'll be sometime soon, let's just say within 5 years, that people will have virtual companies, right? Where they don't have to do anything. They just create a money machine that has automation, that provides some sort of service that is close to hands off. That there's some things that are getting close to that. I heard another person say there's going to be a $1 billion company pretty soon that has 3 employees. So it's, those things are kind of shocking to me, or just, it's it's a new day, it's a new dawn when we think in those
Right.
terms.
Right. Well, there's two ideas that I would kind of offer to counter those future
Okay,
dreams. One
sure.
is that every time money is exchanged, every time someone gets money for a business, there's two people on both sides of those things. There's a guy paying the money voluntarily to get something that he doesn't have that he wants. Then there's a person producing that thing. And you can use massive economies of scale with AI for one person to produce a lot of stuff and maybe make a lot of money, but that will still fall under the Pareto distribution
Mm,
because everybody will be trying to do that. And
right.
20% of the people might make a profit, but 80% of the people that will try this new technology that will let you run a company by yourself, 80% won't really make much. And
Mm.
so that's still going to fall under the Pareto distribution. So, yeah, there might be a few companies that are $1 billion companies that's really run by one guy, but that won't be the norm. For most people, most of these new tech things will be helpful at best and maybe insignificant at worst. It's
That's
easy for
interesting.
us. It's easy for us. It's interesting to us. It's fascinating to us to dream about these magic futures where nobody has to do any work and everybody gets $1 million. But that's really unrealistic because if nobody's doing any work, if everybody owns $1 billion company, then that means there's $8 billion people on earth, each that own $1 billion company. That means each of the 8 billion people on earth are somehow receiving $1 billion from who?
Well, if that's true, then other people will have money to spend. But
Yeah.
but you kind of reminded me there of, I think I heard a stat that it might be as high as 50%, but it's a super high percentage of all the classical music that is performed and all the revenue that's generated in classical music is generated by 5 composers.
Yeah,
So
I
that's
believe that.
hundreds of years, right? It's been around a
Mhm.
while. So it seems like you're pointing to a similar thing. Like that part of how things work isn't about to change. So
Yeah, well,
why would we?
that's based on the Pareto distribution, and the Pareto distribution has nothing to do with human nature. I mean, if you took all
Right.
of the lakes in the United States, 20% of the lakes would have 80% of the water. It's just a regular way that reality spreads itself out statistically. And the Pareto distribution is not, it doesn't just stop at that 20%. 20% of the people get 80% of the stuff, but 20% of the 20% get 80% of the 80%, or 4% get 64%, or 20% of the 20% of the 20% get 80 of 80 of 80, which is about 0.8% get like a little over 50%. So it makes perfect sense for a statistic that says that 5 composers have 50% of the revenue or whatever from music, because that's just the way reality spreads itself out. It just seems like it doesn't make sense because our monkey brains don't really have a intuitive handle on statistics in large numbers.
Well, and that makes sense to me what you just said. That and it because it transfers to lakes and things that are not anthropomorphic. The the idea there is, why are we upset about these distributions? Why do we say that, oh, the one percenters, or this person has all the luck, or we have this sort of jealousy where if we're not in that obvious sticking out percentage, that we say something is wrong, or there's been some sort of moral um, transgression. Well,
Well, I believe that is down to what I mentioned before, which is instinct mismatch.
mm,
We evolved to live in hunter gatherer communities where everybody knew everybody. And so when the alpha came back, dragging the woolly mammoth behind him, and his job was to share with everybody. It literally was the owner's or the leader's responsibility to literally share the wealth with to redistribute the wealth. And if he didn't do that, if he was an alpha and went out and killed a woolly mammoth by himself and didn't share, that would set off all kinds of he's cheating instincts in everybody. And that kind of kept tribal cohesion. And so we have this kind of tribal mindset that we apply in the modern world. And we see somebody that's making a lot of money and they're not helping us. It triggers that cheating instinct. But that's just another instinct that we need to understand and manage. And unfortunately, most people can't do that. In fact, according to one of my favorite writers, Thomas Sowell, an economist, he points out that one of the most common political lies since the dawn of time is a politician says, your problems are not your fault. Your problems are those people's fault. Vote for me and I'll fix it.
mm.
Leveraging that instinct that says they are cheating if they have more than I do.
And that drags us down with all kinds of really, really dumb things that we tend to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. And now with social media and instant information, that idea gets absolutely permeated through society that
Mm.
it's not my fault that my life sucks. It's somebody else's fault. So I have to just sit around and wait for someone to come and fix it or punish them or whatever, or take their stuff and give it to me.
And that's at diametric opposition with what you were talking about earlier about discipline and
Exactly.
responsibility, which is where your joy is. You're going to find your joy there. As soon as you
Exactly.
start to put on the victim hat, you've basically roped joy off from your life.
Yeah. You're cutting off your own source of your greatest power.
Yeah, that's something that I talk about a lot in I Power community is that, you know, whether you're a victim or not is really beside the point.
Yeah. It might be true that something's wrong and it's somebody else's fault, but it's not your responsibility to sit in that. It's your responsibility to fix it, because even from a strategic standpoint, the other person is not going to say they're sorry and come and fix your life. It's just a horrible strategy to wait for somebody else to come and fix your life, because nobody cares about your life as much as you do. And if you're outsourcing your greatest power to somebody else who doesn't care about you, that's got to be the dumbest strategy in the world.
Oh boy, we could go down the political realm of ways, I'm sure.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
that's not really the focus of what we're talking about here today. It's more the personal power rather than authority over others or what policy should be. But these things do ring true, but at the individual level as well as at the the societal level. So I think that is important to look at these kind of patterns that help us better understand what's real and what's not. That we've packed in a lot in a short amount of time there,
yeah,
George.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
you put some serious knowledge bombs down here with discipline. I love the instinct mismatch. I think that's a great
yeah,
way to framing to try to understand ourselves better and gives ourselves permission to say, okay, that's why I'm having this reaction or
right,
this feeling or
right.
why I did this dumb thing 200 times. So
Yeah,
you can give yourself a little grace and then enjoy the journey as you add skills and move on, right?
yeah, yeah. It's actually the instinct mismatch idea is my kind of modernized understanding of Jung's famous statement that unless you make the unconscious conscious, it will run your life and you will call it fate. I think a better
Yes.
description would be unless you understand and manage your instincts, your life's going to be a train wreck.
I'm going to use that one, okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, would you say there's any other topic that we haven't managed to get into that you would think that would be appropriate to what we've been looking at so far, George?
I'm sure there's plenty. I mean, we could go on for days, really, but
Well,
generally that's about it.
this seems
Under,
pretty, this seemed to me very, very tight and focused on a narrative that I think is going to work very well for an episode. So I think that's going to work pretty well.
good, good.
So thank you very much.
Oh, thanks for having me. I very much enjoyed the conversation. I love talking about this stuff.
So how do how do I benefit you as far as I've got your links through Podmatch that I'll put on my website when the
Yeah,
episode
that's
comes out.
fine. Yeah, just
Is there anything beyond that?
no, that's it. Mindpersuasion.com. That's my main site, and that's where all of the goods flow through.
Yep. Okay. I'd like to thank George Hutton for being on the show today. Very much enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you did too. I got a lot out of it. Some of the things that I thought stood out were the daily discipline that he shared that allowed him to think in terms of productive minutes that sustained over time, led him to over 100 books and counting, as well as a thriving business and a lot of insights that he was able to bring about for himself and others that he works with. The instinct mismatch that he spoke about, take riffing off of some Jungian sort of knowledge. We talk about that a lot in the Eye of Power, don't we? We talk about integrating the shadow and having the courage and honesty to look within, and how important that is to unlock our full agency and our potential. And when we play the games driven by instincts that no longer match our world, so it's not really a character flaw or fault, it's what's going to happen unless we find ourselves exercising discipline and responsibility in order to further our skills and further our abilities in that new environment. And it's changing all the time. We are going to cut ourselves off and have to learn a lot of lessons the hard way. And so I thought the way that George described some of these things really put a fresh perspective and a new spin on things that we talk a lot about in the Eye of Power. So I'd like to thank George very much. Until next time, thank you.
This has been the Eye of Power podcast with Tom Dardick. I'd like to thank you for listening. I'd also like to thank my brother Scott Dardick for the music and his music production. If you'd like to reach me, simply email Tom at dardickcommunications.com.